I call Fletcher Tabato.
Thank you, sir. It is always a pleasure to stand on an evening such as this one, to be the only party in the House opposing token gestures, waste of time legislation that achieves nothing. And you think I'm just talking using my own words, but those are quotes from most of the accounting firms in New Zealand. So I'll get to the detail of that soon. But first of all, I'd like to acknowledge the Minister. What a detailed, comprehensive and lengthy contribution he gave to the House tonight. It was certainly appreciated by the members on this side of the House. It was elucidating, Mr Bailey. Mr Bailey, it most certainly was. And as for Mr Bennett, it is always a pleasure to see Mr Bennett stand up and make a contribution in this House. And I tell you why, Mr Speaker, because every word he says makes any National supporter question why on earth they are supporting the National Party when Mr Bennett speaks just about on anything, actually. And his contribution, as always, as the chairman of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee, actually spoke about nothing to do with the legislation at hand tonight. It was wonderful. It was wonderful. Mr Bailey, I was sitting there, and Mr Bailey said, sir, that he would speak to the student loans element of the legislation. And so I was sitting there with bated breath, and then he stopped. So it was like 30 seconds of build-up, and then huge disappointment because nothing actually came of it. So, but Mr Speaker, can I speak to this omnibus bill? And I just want to say there seems to be no rational reason why these kind of very disparate parts of legislation are joined together in one piece of legislation. They're very distinct. And had the government done their job properly and actually submitted legislation on those parts, New Zealand First would have actually been standing here tonight and whatever other nights it would have taken to support 2/3 of the legislation. We think in all parts the government hasn't gone far enough, but actually in two parts they're almost there. And so let me speak to those piece by piece, Mr Speaker. So GST on online services, sir. I've actually had to go out, because of the nature of this omnibus bill, I've had to go out to retailers and small business and explain our stance on this legislation, because we absolutely support the necessity to level the playing field for New Zealand business. It's an absolute necessity. So we've gone out there, we've talked to business, and I've said it in this House before, the government's apathy, sir, has been hurting New Zealand's small business for the last 9 years. We have seen businesses close up shop, we have seen businesses dismiss staff, get rid of staff, because they literally cannot compete on what is supposed to be an even playing field. That 15% may not sound like a lot to you and I, sir, but when you're talking margins of, well, certainly less than that, in most small retail operations, the margins on most of the products in those shops are minuscule. So to have that 15% disadvantage has been holding back New Zealand retailers for a long time. And I'm sure the members on the other side will agree that as the internet capabilities expand, as New Zealand consumers become more savvy in their buying habits, they see that difference, sir, and their buying behaviour reacts to that advantage afforded to foreign corporates, essentially. Why is this government, who small businesses see as advocates and spokespeople for them, why has it taken this government 9 years to get to this point? And can I say, sir, that it is a half measure at best? I'll just try and find a quote here from several of the contributors who spoke to the Select Committee. The bill further delays addressing the issue of low-value goods, which they say is a long-standing and significant problem that disadvantages domestic retailers and negative repercussions for the whole economy. That's right. This spills out not just for our retailers but to the whole economy, Mr Speaker. We are talking about closed shops and staff staff members being fired from these small businesses for lack of a fair, competitive playing field for New Zealand businesses. And there is no dispute about the fact that that level playing field has been tilted in advantage of the foreign corporates. It just makes no sense whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. So what New Zealand First says is if that had been a piece of legislation unto itself, we think it's a step in the right direction. We think the arguments against a full implementation for intangible and tangible goods don't make sense in terms of customs funding. They don't stack up. We think given the likes of Amazon and other online retailers being ready and geared up to implement our GST at the click of a button, they could have done it straight away. And maybe 95% of those goods could have had GST placed on them, and the level playing field would have been a meaningful one in terms of the famous five, the book or the e-book. It's a half measure, and as submitters noted, it doesn't go far enough, and we're just going to wait for years more for that playing field to be levelled, and it's just not acceptable and it's not right. Now, New Zealand First cannot support the resident land withholding tax legislation, Mr. Speaker. This is, the bright line test is actually a new capital gains tax on top of an existing capital gains tax that everyone on this side refuses to call a capital gains tax for some bizarre reason. Mr. Nash spoke eloquently about the intent of the existing legislation, and that is the reality of it. So New Zealand First would argue that the empowerment and adequate resourcing of the IRD to enforce existing legislation would have been a huge step in the right direction of addressing the issue of, ludicrous housing prices in the Auckland market. And to that, we've seen it. So this is the third part of the supposed triumvirate of bright line legislation. So we've seen the implementation of the first two parts. And what we have seen already in the Auckland market is there was a slowdown. There was an initial reaction to those first two pieces of legislation, and the market actually slowed down for a very brief period. But those foreign investors saw what the requirements were and said, oh, don't worry about it. Let's go back full swing. It's not going to affect us. We can get around this. No worries whatsoever, sir. So the housing market in Auckland continues to spiral out of control. And what we're seeing is that spillover outside of that super city region, down into Hamilton, down into Tauranga, and even into Rotorua, sir, my home electorate. So it is a non-attempt from this government to deal with a very, very real issue. We cannot support such a token gesture. Empowering the IRD, like I said, would have addressed most of the issue and had a meaningful impact on the continuing problem, especially in Auckland. This bill, sir, is flawed. It is half measures in all parts. And as such, New Zealand First cannot support such a waste of time for this House. It is a token gesture to allow for managed spin, a spin campaign, so this government can say they're doing something which they absolutely are not, and they are not dealing with a very real issue with meaningful legislation. Mr. Speaker, we cannot support this bill. Thank you.
I call Alice.